The majesty of the Italian landscape contains no shortage of wondrous secrets concerning its structures and its infrastructure. We'll find the common examples of civilizations that are built on top of other civilizations in Italy, and the mainstream has our typical historical account for this. We originally had the Etruscans were followed by the Romans, and there were many other great tribes, the Samnites, and too many to list. And yet in all the beauty of Italy we find examples of previous civilizations, and how many of them are far more contemporaneous than we like to imagine.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Today we look at northern Italy, in our first exploration of a wondrous city that's not Rome or the Vatican. We explore the city of Bologna, a city of wonders, towers, and porticos. What's the mainstream history, though, behind this incredible city? Even the pronunciation of Bologna is something that varies. We refer to the Etruscans, a people whose history we only have examples of through Rome, and then of course the presence of the Roman Catholic Church, producing many great pontiffs and bishops, and even the presence of the Byzantine Empire, supposedly the successor empire of Rome, the very first and continuous university that operates in Bologna to this day. Also a city that was afflicted by the bubonic plague, and many other infrastructure wonders that dot the landscape, to include an incredible opera house. And over time, there was even a library, the State Archives, yet it wasn't established until the 1870s. In 1897, the population was 153,000, up from 71,000 in 1800. Not quite the increase we see in the United States. And then it endured the conflict of World War II, and yet many of its structures survived intact, to include these incredible towers. Towers which are reminiscent of what we think of as skyscrapers today. And indeed, these towers, these skyscrapers, the few that survive in Bologna, remind us of the wonders and the majesty of a city in the distant past that seem to reflect a previous civilization. There's also the many porticos. Everywhere you shop or walk around in Bologna, you'll see no shortage of incredible porticos. And anywhere in Italy, I'm always amazed at the composition of the very streets and the roads, which can still support large buses to this day. And wherever you go in Bologna, you'll see the remaining towers and the structures made of some sort of stone masonry work, whatever the composition is. Let's look at some of the city images from the 18 and 1900s, and this is the most dramatic example of seeing the original towers of Bologna. We'll look at these towers closely at the end of this exploration, and they give the impression of a more modern city. Of course, when we look at such articles on verticality and other modern architectural periodicals, they'll explain this as simply being an anomaly of the time, that there were certain rich families and the culturally elite of Bologna, even before the Renaissance, who decided to build all these wondrous towers. And of course, for those of us with the mindset that we have, we realize that there may be a vastly different explanation and origin behind this incredible city that still endures to this day. We can see the details of architecture that show us that there was a much more advanced civilization at work here. Imagine this city that we're told during the Middle Ages never exceeded a population of 60,000, and then in 1800 their population managed to come up to near 70,000, and then not even 100 years later up over 150,000. And that's explained away by the revolutions of industry and agriculture that we still argue about which one preceded the other. But whatever the mainstream account and the actual history of Bologna is, you will find no shortage of dramatic images that give you the impression of these wondrous structures always being present on the landscape. You'll find no shortage of paintings and pictures that show the infinite porticos that run for miles, leading up to incredible structures, such as this monastery. Yes, yet another isolated monastery. And yet in the streets there are incredible buildings with wondrous detail constructed on them. And many people will accept the mainstream explanation that this was simply the work of people who were more devoted and yet somehow had a tremendous logistical capacity in the 11 and 1200s to build these incredible towers and many of these buildings. When you look into the personal account of many of these buildings or these structures in Bologna, what you'll find is a statement that they've been modified and structures built on top of the other. Indeed, this tends to be the hallmark of any major city in Italy. And we're going to be exploring several, seeking answers for why is it we have these anomalies. The story behind these towers is quite interesting, and to actually give the mainstream some credit, they admit that they don't know the full reason for the towers. There's also the infinite porticos that run through Bologna, where everywhere you see you have arches and covered areas to walk, all made out of solid stone, or concrete, or some mixture. Perhaps it's even some sort of material that we aren't even familiar with. The official explanation will be that Roman concrete was only used during the time of Rome, and yet somehow most of these porticos, we're told, were constructed well after Rome. And you'll find no shortage of public squares or piazzas where the people gather and they have that understanding of what exactly they're doing. Or maybe in some of these pictures they don't seem to know exactly what they're doing and they seem to be just as awed by this architecture as we are. Looking at the interior, you'll also see an interesting combination of stonework and columns that are fully milled and yet other columns that are made of separate blocks and bricks. And was this a monastery or was it some sort of stronghold? And even in this image, we can see just how extensive some of these porticos actually are. This infinite portico that almost feels like it runs the same length of an aqueduct. And it gives the impression of a civilization that had no limits in terms of its logistical capacity or its focus and its capability in order to lay out such an extensive structure that continues on to the very horizon in this image. Imagine the effort that would have been required to construct this. And of course, the mainstream will tell us that there were no shortage of laborers, no shortage of skilled laborers, even in the 11 to the 1500s, and that it all makes perfect sense. Yet you can also see some of the hallmarks of the more advanced architecture looking more closely at the structures. And we've seen all these examples and these patterns before of the layout of the blocks. Indeed, many of the star forts that we've looked at in the United States. And the official explanation is that the very aspect of Rome and the architectural stylings were rediscovered, and then once they were rediscovered, they were shared to other cultures. Yet, looking at many of these images, you can see the examples of much greater advancement just in terms of the detail. Every single adornment above the windows and the doors reflects something that shows a lot more of an attention to detail placed in the artistic expression. If you ask any architect today, they will give you the official explanation of the fact that people valued artistic expression in the past, and there was obviously a lot more money to go around. But even with the money, you still need people who are capable of doing these sorts of things. And the question I'll ask for you to consider today is there any contractor anywhere in the land, whether you're in Europe, Africa, North America, South America, that you could find who could lay out a structure like this? Even a simple structure that's a single-family dwelling that would contain any of these architectural hallmarks. And then could they do it with a genuine material? Would you find any contractor that could actually carry out the task from start to finish and could build with the same quality as this? And once again, the typical explanation you'll get in terms of why it cannot be done is we simply have a shortage of skilled laborers. We don't have the contractors who could do this. And there's other numerous reasons why the quality of construction materials has diminished. It's certainly not because we could not reproduce the quality of these construction materials. Absolutely not. We could. It's just not economically viable. When you actually walk through a city such as Bologna, or really any other city in Italy for that matter, you'll see these examples of these many architectural stylings, and you'll also get the impression of the wondrous logistical capacity that was required to bring all of this building material into a city at that time before the age of motorization and before the time of the train. So how exactly was it done? Simple persistence, is that what we're supposed to believe? Or was there some other capability? Were there other capacities that were present in Italy at a time that we can't even begin to imagine? During a time frame that we're not told to even think on. Remember that Bologna was originally settled by Etruscans. Of course, we don't really have any history of Etruscans except for the history that was recorded by Rome, the city-state that defeated the Etruscans and then either amalgamated or destroyed their civilization. And there's even conflicting accounts on that. There's even the conflicting accounts of the fact that we always talk about in history how we oftentimes rediscover the great advancements and achievements of both Rome and Greece. And indeed, when we look at Bologna University, we'll find one of the individuals who was allegedly responsible for that. Looking at the towers, though, you get the impression that there were greater intentions behind them, that perhaps these are just the smaller towers that remain, that there may well have been more dramatic and studious examples of the architectural achievements of the past that we cannot simply explain. What remains today, though, is still impressive, and you don't see anyone building like this anywhere in the land, for the aforementioned reasons that we have. And when you go to Bologna, or if you go to any of the other cities across the Italian peninsula, you'll see these examples. You also should pay attention to the composition of the very roads and the streets that all these structures are built upon. And remember when we explored the Vatican, the labyrinth and almost maze-like precision that they had in the construction of the foundations. Consider that with all these buildings and all of this overlapping infrastructure that's built on top of each other. Does it really give the impression of a singular city that was laid out over time and somehow everything just seemed to fit together because of circumstance? Or was it an original plan? Original plan that was carried out by a civilization that had a greater capacity for both logistics and the ability to plan. Or we just simply believe the mainstream account, that there were all of these polymaths who were experts in everything, who just seemed to multiply at a particular time, and they were responsible for the sudden revolution in architectural stylings that came across Italy all at the same time during the so-called Renaissance period. What's interesting to me, though, about Bologna is that the very towers themselves, and indeed many of the structures we're told, were actually planned and then constructed before the Renaissance period, or that they were responsible for motivating and inciting the Renaissance period. How convenient. Is that exactly how it worked, or is there a much different explanation? Is it simply because there were people who had wealth and resources that decided they were going to devote those wealth and resources towards architectural constructions and artistic expression, and that was going to be their way of leaving their mark? Or were there other explanations? Because as we always talk about when we look at these great cities and these wondrous structures, their very presence seems to defy the explanation of these being simple vanity projects, as indeed many of these structures reflect a community project. And of course we have our early presence of trolleys within Bologna, Italy, in many of these images that we see in the 1800s. Of course, we have an image of a horse-pulled trolley, which is quite intriguing, as it's not just simply a horse-pulled cart, and we have our usual explanations for that. So once again, it's the same pattern that we have in the images that we've seen in many of the explorations that we've done in the United States, which show us that this almost seems to be an area that was rediscovered and repopulated in a very short amount of time. Bologna contains the oldest continuous university in the land, the University of Bologna. And since being in operation in 1088, it contains many wondrous alumni who have made quite a difference across the land. And what a very impressive university. Imagine looking at such architecture every day when you go to classes. And I have no doubt that the individuals that we're told about in history, look at that. Let's not forget that in Italy we had the A-Tor, the Fighting Eagle series, which included the hubcap from Napa and, oddly enough, a cameo from Paul Wellstone, Senator of Minnesota. Noted alumni include Batizia Gozzadina, who was a jurist or a lawyer. Yes, one of the very first prominent female students who was a lawyer even before the Renaissance. Quite a fascinating account when we're constantly told about how women had no rights or no place in society, and yet we have conflicting historical accounts that show that they were quite essential in history. And indeed, Batizia here was quite an effective lawyer, apparently, as she's remembered in history. And of course, we think about the aspects of legal work and jurists in pre-Renaissance Italy. Then we have Petrarch, who was a poet and apparently one of the individuals who rediscovered Rome, one of many, and you can see that the thrilling headgear styles at the time was not confined to the ladies. Imagine wearing an outfit like that, much like we were told to wear facial adornments 4 years ago. And then we have Pope Alexander VI, another alumni of Bologna University, who is known for very controversial, how shall we say, personal tastes He was the Pope who actually had children, so you can see that no children with the clergy was around back then. And Umberto Eco, the author of the book The Name of the Rose, which is featured many times in this particular channel. Umberto Eco had quite the history himself. Indeed, the very libraries that dot the landscape across Italy are always compelling, and you'll find no shortage of them in these wondrous buildings and structures that are all across the landscape of Bologna. The University of Bologna containing many of them. And whether you're going there for economics or genetics or literature or whatever your particular major will be, you'll find yourself completely overtaken by the wondrous beauty in the architecture. I believe this particular tower is supposedly part of the College of Economics. Imagine seeing a structure like that when you're studying economics. But don't worry, the University of Bologna has some more modern buildings, and oddly enough, the astronomy department is supposedly located in that one. But looking at these immense public squares and seeing how the university itself is integrated within Bologna, and for the surrounding image on this particular portion of the exploration, I am showing a university from Ukraine because Bologna was supposedly the inspiration in 1088 for all the universities that followed. So wherever you are in the land, whenever you look at the beauty of any university, we're officially told it was inspired by the continuous operating university in Bologna from 1088, and that's why you have all these wonderful and gorgeous buildings that seem to accompany every university, at least according to the mainstream account. Well, let's go from the university to the Bologna Cathedral, built 910 to the 1700s, and it's still incomplete to this day. And we've looked at many cathedrals on this channel, and this one has a little bit more of an interesting account to it. Not to say that they all aren't interesting, but that's because we're told officially that this one is not complete. And indeed, when you look at the front facade, you can see that it's clearly not complete. Or is that actually what happened, or is there some other account behind it? Perhaps they took portions of the exterior to aid in construction of other buildings, such as they did with the cover stones of the pyramid. Or maybe there's some other account behind it. Officially, we're told that there was originally a cathedral here, there's the usual story of fire and damage, and then they had to build a new cathedral. And then they spent a good 800-900 years building that cathedral. Additions, subtractions. There's even diagrams that show what different designs of the completed facade would look like. Very strange that we have so many of these designs that are readily available in the records, even though we're told that the state archive didn't even start until the late 1800s. But perhaps there were previous archives that were available that did a good job of preserving the records, and we're not simply looking at recordings that were done later, or sketches that give other indications for what the Bologna Cathedral were actually supposed to look like. Or another possibility, that these are actually drawings of other structures that were present across the landscape in Bologna, that are no longer present to this day. Not that I'm suggesting that anyone would do such a thing, I'm just posing other explanations for why we have so many drawings. And once again, you can see that there is an incredible and almost spiritual beauty that we have with all these cathedrals and their interiors. And yet we have to remember that the ability to produce and reproduce this beauty is not confined to Italy. It can be done anywhere across the land. But yet you can see the same kind of geometric precision that we see across these structures, almost indicating that they may have had a different function at one point in time. And again, were the pews part of the construction? Were they added later? And of course, it wouldn't be a cathedral without the wondrous and almost futuristic appearing organs that we always come across. And there's a couple different examples of wondrous organs that we have in this Bologna Cathedral. Look at the ceiling and the way that the columns reach up to it with all the detailing on it. And even though the exterior is incomplete, it did not detract them from finishing the interior. Now, recall that it's much more difficult to construct such an elaborate interior of a building than it is the exterior, and here's why they didn't spare the detail. And interestingly enough, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when each portion of the cathedral in Bologna was officially constructed according to the mainstream history because of the fact that it's been added to so many times. Perhaps it seems a little modest on the outside, but the aspect we have to remember is just how intricately all this is fit together, as it is in the other cities of Italy, and recall our exploration of the Vatican. But then once you get in the inside and you see the wonders of the architectural detailing and the beauty of even the organs and every single decoration that's across these wondrous cathedrals, and suddenly it reflects not only a spiritual strength, but perhaps a strength of a humanity or something that is motivated beyond our true ability to understand? What does it actually reflect? Is there a real religious element to it? There may well be. Or there could be something even beyond our ability to fully understand. Every time I look at one of these organs, I'm reminded of how it seemed we had the capacity to construct wonders in the past that we don't seem to be able to reproduce today. And yet the same people who will denigrate you for thinking such a thing will tell you that, of course, people in the past had more capability. Yes, it's a contradiction. It's an intentional contradiction because you're just supposed to believe exactly as you're told to believe. Questioning things is not something that you're encouraged to ever do, which is interesting to me as it seems to fly in the very face of what was the original scientific method. But we have to recall that there's a difference between methods and dogmatic beliefs. I could understand, though, why someone would want to embrace a dogmatic belief looking at such a structure like this that seems to have been divinely inspired. And even on the more modest exterior, you can see that we still have the same architectural stylings that were told motivated and inspired the buildings across the land, with the columns and the pillars that are integrated in the very walls, and intricate detailing. Still, the front facade of this Cathedral of Bologna is quite intriguing, and it does point to a very different account than what we're told. Are we really to believe that there's all these examples of all these structures that they spent hundreds of years building and rebuilding and modifying? Or is there another account behind these structures? Were these structures once part of an even grander overall design? And indeed, that's often the impression that you get when you explore the beautiful and yet mysterious cities across Italy, Bologna notwithstanding. And the aspect that always intrigued me, and if you ever walk around a city in Italy, is just how they managed to make such efficient use of all the space, as though it were planned out in ways that we can't quite imagine. And no shortage of incredible cathedrals across the land, and now we go to the Bologna Municipal Theater, supposedly built 1763, although hard to ascertain exactly when it was constructed. And once again, this is another example of these incredible theaters or opera houses that we have across the land, whether it's supposedly for opera or even in the smallest towns in the United States, we always seem to have a wondrous opera house. We have the same portico present because the portico seems to be a style that's pertinent to Bologna, which is interesting as it shows there may be architectural variances. Of course, the arches themselves are to be seen everywhere. And the interior of this theater is lavish and large and beautiful and spacious beyond the ability to imagine. The 1760s. Actually, there's accounts that say it was constructed through the 1750s, but who's to know for sure? And you have the usual adornments of the chandeliers and the vast, tall windows, which we're told was to allow the lighting in. Although how exactly they allowed the lighting into the theater, those are questions you're not supposed to ask, because remember, electricity was not invented until the later 1800s. And who needed that, though, to light a theater like this? They just had candles, and people were very persistent. Or maybe they just didn't do shows at night. Again, those are questions you're not supposed to ask. It's not just the main theater, though. When you look at many of the entryways and the lobbies and the gathering rooms, or whatever you want to call them, the assembly rooms, you'll see the same detailing that you see in the main theater. The wonderful overlap and intersecting of many architectural styles. And I have to ask, how exactly was this achieved in the 1700s as we're told? Well, simple, persistence, and they had money. I don't know what it is, though, but every time I look at one of these beautiful theaters and all the elaborate adornments that they have on the inside, I'm always reminded of something. I'm reminded of how they reflect and echo sound and how they're designed for that. But what was their original purpose? Of course, in an opera house, I have flashbacks of something like this coming to my mind. I think I see my friend Ramirez down there. He's performing in the audience. I can't believe it. I remember when we were from Zeist. Yes, Zeist. Okay, that's really, really hard on the throat. Might need to get a brush down there for that. But opera houses have always been a part of our society and our culture, and every time we look at these amazing theaters, they never cease to inspire me. And we're supposed to believe that these were all done simply for entertainment purposes, because we appreciated opera, and now we appreciate good movies. And finally, we go to the mystery of the towers. Built 1100 to 1200 or so, we're told, and we're told that these towers were supposedly built by the wealthy families of Bologna. Now keep in mind, this was well before the Renaissance, and this was well before the Industrial Revolution, which is sort of our cheat code, if you will, to explain things. Of course, we could use the other cheat code and say that it was forced labor that did this. Now, the Romans had slavery, and during the medieval time frame, we're told that they had serfs. But how exactly did they achieve this in Bologna in 1100 to 1200? To be fair to the mainstream, they don't know the exact purpose behind these wondrous towers, and yet when you look at some of the old images or renderings of Bologna, you can get an idea of its glory. To this day, they're called the lost skyscrapers of Italy, and you can see why that is so. We'll completely ignore the fact that there is a very unique commonality with the appearance of a modern city. And consider the fact that we're told that many of these towers, or skyscrapers, or whatever you want to call them, have been lost over the years. Now, there's a leaning one, and much like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, it seems to be an example of how old world architecture was just not that safe and not that stable. We'll just completely ignore the fact that those towers are still standing to this day, and that they're closing on 1,000 years old in some cases. Can you imagine building a structure today that'll last for 1,000 years? I mean, I'm sure we can go ahead and believe that our modern skyscrapers will, and if you want to believe that, you're welcome to. And I guess as it all comes down, we'll see. But with the older structures in these towers in Bologna, you can see that they're not just towers, they have the same kind of base stones. And for some reason, I'm reminded of the standpipe water towers that we explored in St. Louis and in other cities across the United States. So again, we're seeing these common architectural touches and these common touches in engineering. Although this is from 11 to 1200, and then we're told that those standpipe water towers in the United States were constructed predominantly from 1870 onward. So what's the actual explanation? Are we to really believe the mainstream historical account that we just have these overlaps in architectural stylings because they were rediscovered, and when they were rediscovered, people managed to be experts in them, and therefore they built exact replicas of what came before with the exact same type of material? And if we actually go and visit these structures in person and you assess the material yourself, you'll notice they're the exact same thing. It's certainly not a lot of the facading or the, how shall we say, lesser quality construction material that's available in abundance to us to this day. I'm sure there is a logical explanation, and of course it's because of economic reasons. Indeed, when you look at the top of these towers, though, you get the impression that they seem to be more for offensive and defensive purposes. And again, I'll give credit to the mainstream in this aspect because they do admit they don't fully know what the purpose of these towers were. And I'll be honest, I don't know what the purpose of these towers were. Were they for residence? Did they have some other function? Perhaps there's a clue in the offensive and defensive aspects behind them. How exactly does one use a tower, which is supposed to be supposedly a defensive fortification, for offensive purposes? Unless these towers had some other capability behind them that we're not aware of, and it's only alluded to in what we still have in the recorded history, at least what of the recorded history that may be factual, and the myths and the legends. And indeed, we can also attempt to extrapolate or speculate in terms of their actual function. Now, I ask you, what are you supposed to do? If the mainstream does not have an explanation for what these towers were built for, are you just supposed to accept the fact that they were there? Well, they were there. We don't know their purpose, and we shouldn't try to guess, because that's just wrong to do, until someone comes along and tells us what we should think about something. Or perhaps you can exercise your minds and use the creativity and imagination that you're endowed with to try to find the actual explanation for what these towers may have been constructed for. And with that, I leave it to you to let me know in the comments. What do you believe is the real purpose behind these towers? Are these merely the vanity project of the wealthy and elite of Bologna from 11 to 1200, or do they reflect a previous civilization, the bare bones remnants of it? Bologna is a fascinating city. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but
Laughing a lot on this set about where are you from Zeist, and